Well, everybody, either Eddie Jones's revival of the Wallabies is going to be a much harder task than I thought, or it's 2015 all over again. When Michael Cheika took over the Wallabies in similar circumstances during their 2014 season, they took 3 brutal losses, and Eddie Jones's return to this role, less than a year out from a World Cup, has also begun with some brutal results. While Cheika's first game in charge of the Wallabies was a win over Wales, Jones's first game back was a hammering at the hands of South Africa. While I expected a narrow win for Australia due to Jones's reputation of changing a team quickly in the short term, this was completely different in terms of mentality from the Boks to what we've seen in the past. The Springboks, for the first time in a long time, turned up to move the ball and play expansive rugby, and they completely blindsided both me and the opposition to play their best game since the 2019 Rugby World Cup final. Now that we've seen the 43-12 result, let's ask a few questions after performing an analysis on the game. But before we get into everything, everybody, remember to subscribe to me down below and like this video if you enjoy it at the end. Now everybody, let's get into this. The first of a fair few problems with Australia I'll discuss is obviously their line-out. Their first try, however, comes off their own missed throw. Although Jean Kleyn gets well above Nick Frost, he tosses the turnover a little bit far past Bongi Mbonambi. James Slipper spots the error straight away, as does Alan Ala-Alator, who was hidden behind the line-out. As Ala-Alator gets the right bounce and beats Mbonambi to the ball, Slipper is already available to clean the ruck, while Pieter-Steph du Toit, who is interestingly defended from first receiver, gets forced out of the defensive line to tackle Ala-Alator. Because of this mistake by Jean Kleyn in the 4-man lineout, Australia begin the second phase with an extra man out wide as Nick White receives the ball. The overlap results in Marnie Lebok marking Rob Valetini, while Marco van Staden lines up Will Skelton. Now, because of the defensive mismatch, Lucanio Arm and Andre Esterhuizen shoot up out of the line straight away out of instincts, looking to cover Lebok, who is their second to smallest player. While they do so, Quade Cooper circles around from behind Valetini, reading the Springboks defence very well. Having set the formation out wide already, Cooper skip passes Reece Hodge so that the defensive pressure is no longer applied. As many will notice from South Africa's press defence strategy that operates in a bar chart shaped press forward, it's very hard to defend, but once you get on the outside you expose their very thin cover from behind. This happens here with the last player in their main line, Canan Moodie, now having to shoot up much quicker than he's used to. While Arm would be certain to smash Hodge backwards in this freeze frame here, the initial overlap for Australia has given them the room to place Iki Tau in a much deeper position that will leave Moody's outside totally unguarded. Moody does well to stop Arm's misread of a pass to Hodge from opening a gap, but now gives Iki Tau 2 players on his outside. The initial overlap created by du Toit's tackle hasn't turned out as badly for South Africa as it could have, but with Australia obviously researching the default South Africa defence, Willie le Roux has no other choice but to mark Tom right and let Marika Koroibete get a clean break. It's all a done deal from there as Esterhuizen tries to track back but misses the tackle, allowing Koroibete to score. The biggest surprise of the game though wasn't Australia researching their opposition for the first time since 2013. It was the fact that the Springboks actually turned up to play rugby. Now everybody, I've got a theory that Eddie Jones was trying to beat the Springboks at their own game, as he needs a bit more time to work with the Wallabies on their structure behind the scenes, as they've only been together for 2 weeks. And so when he did this wee thing, he wasn't expecting the Springboks to play a far more expansive game, as historically the Springboks have played the game far slower. They've faked injuries just to take momentum out of the opposition's feel for the game. Like, it's a whole tactical thing they have been doing in the past, but we saw none of that this evening. As we'll see through the stats later on, the Springboks had this clear intent to kill that the Wallabies just simply weren't expecting. The Springboks are a very dominant team at the set piece, and so Eddie Jones was prioritising that kind of stuff, selecting Tom Hooper as a third lock to play 6, so that they could defeat them in the counter ruck, defeat them in the line-out, and defeat them in the scrum. It was a really bad idea for Eddie Jones to try and beat the Springboks at their own game, and so what we get here is a bit of punishment for this approach being taken. Tom Hooper, who had a debut to forget, has completely taken his eyes off his teammates' defensive pattern and hasn't looked to mark Kane and Moody on the outside after Reece Hodges' late entry to the defensive line. It's all pretty obvious who is marking who, as the arrows can show us, yet Hooper continues to mark Pieter-Steph du Toit despite Hodge being in the best position to tackle him. Hooper's facial error and failure to recognise the pattern allows Kane and Moody to break the line on the outside, getting the Springboks into the Wallabies 22. What comes next, though, is an even more facial error. Dave Parecki, who was likely the worst player on the pitch, he is 30 years old and was playing his 11th test cap. Hooper was on debut, but there's no excuses for Parecki. When Moody lands in the tackle by Tom Wright, Parecki is offside. The second that Parecki gets himself behind the breakdown, his periphery now places du Toit in his line of vision. Instead of giving up on the ruck to let South Africa retain possession and getting himself in the main line, Parecki continues to stand behind the ruck before Cobus Reinach even gets a hands to the ball, because Parecki refuses to get in the line and is still looking at Reinach once he looks to the Springboks carriers. Nick White, who is a halfback, is now forced to guard the fringes of the ruck and mark Jean Klein, who is a lock, because White is a halfback. Michael Hooper has no other choice but to remain over here instead of spreading out to the right as he is supposed to do. If Hooper moves to where he and Nick Frost should be, there is a gap between himself and the ruck, filled by the smallest Australian player that Klein will no doubt eat for breakfast. As Parecki has forced Hooper to fixate on Klein, Kitsoff is able to gain meters against Frost, before Dave Parecki refuses to spread wide yet again. This time, Frost has clearly marked du Toit, meaning Parecki needs to guard Mbanambi. We've got Mani Labok in behind Mbanambi. Because he's such a small player, he's clearly not a carry threat. He's almost definitely a sacrificial lamb to get front foot ball to continue. As Will Skelton makes the highlight reel hit that Parecki was supposed to make, we finally see the biggest problem with Parecki's poor defensive positioning, which is the fact that Skelton is no longer in this gap over here. With Skelton no longer available to collect the loose ball, Ori is able to recycle it pretty much uncontested before the Springboks distributes to Kurtley Arendse, who's the try scorer. What we get for the Springboks' second try, on the other hand, it's a rehearsed play that's an absolute piece of magic. As the Springboks had thrown 7 lineouts in the first half, the Wallabies went all in on defending that maul, which they actually did really well for most of the first half. As Mbanambi throws on 29-12 though, we can't see any Springboks in the halfback position. Reinach is facing the width of the open side, but he's doing so likely to hide Kurtley Arendse. This formation here, it is something that opposing teams need to be all over before the World Cup. If we crop Reinach out of the picture, Arendse has a fair bit of room to work with. This gap here may open. Committed to stopping the maul, Ala Tor wraps around to join in, but as we spotlight him, we also spotlight Marco van Staden, who had an amazing game from open side flanker. Because van Staden has detached from this maul, this image from the wide shot suddenly removes both Ala Tor from the picture and White from the picture. As Mbanambi carries forward, Suliasi Vunivalu gets forced into a 2-on-1. As 2 Springboks are carrying on the blind side, Vunivalu is drawn in, with only Michael Hooper left in the dust by Arendse, running onto the pass from Mbanambi, scoring try number 2 for himself. Now that we've discussed a very eventful first half, let's go over the halftime stats after the ad break. As we can all see, everybody, Australia, they were still kind of in the game at the halftime whistle. The Springboks, though they had 63% possession, were only leading by 12 points, while they had 48% of the territory, so the Wallabies were doing pretty well to defend them at least. The Springboks had obviously run more meters, made more defenders beat, more clean breaks, and more passes, importantly, than the Wallabies. Kicks on hand, of course, a little bit less, which was kind of interesting. The Wallabies were probably kicking a little bit too much, and this is part of my theory as to how I think they were trying to beat the Springboks at their own game. They were trying to use Reece Hodges, that extra kicker at altitude, and it backfired for sure. The Springboks, I'm not going to complain about their tackle percentage because they didn't make a lot of tackles during the game. I don't think there's too much for us to read into when we look at that. The goal kick success, though, That hurt Australia big time. If Reece Hodge was able to get all of these goal attempts over, South Africa only would have led by 17-13 at half time, and so Reece Hodge's kicking really did not give Australia much help. It gave South Africa a real psychological advantage for the second half. Interestingly though, the ruck success wasn't too different, whereas both teams had really good discipline in the first half. The Wallabies had only conceded 4 penalties in total, whereas the Springboks had conceded just 2. Very good set-piece numbers for the line-out as well, whereas the Wallabies were beating the Springboks in the scrum. Although these discipline stats were very good at the end of half-time, such a statement certainly didn't apply to my thoughts on those stats by the end of the game. Although Australia ended up losing by a huge margin, they truly were still in the game up until Kurtley Arendse's third try, which opened the floodgates. As we can see while Willie le Roux rotates his chest towards 2 possible strike runners on 50-13, Dave Parecki has once again failed to move far away enough from the ruck again. Parecki should be here where Valetini is, while the rest of the team need to shift out to their left. Now that we've made this wee animation, Australia's defensive pattern is supposed to look like this over here, with Valetini marking Kitshoff and Hooper marking Van Staden. But because Parecki has made the same error yet again, Reece Hodge, who's a midfielder, is about to get slaughtered by South Africa's most damaging carrier, or so we think. Le Roux instead works the ball away to Lebok, who played very well, as Hodge's defensive line has had to change at the last second due to the fact that Van Staden drew him in. 2 tacklers are now required to take down Andre Esterhuizen. Because the 2 tacklers to take Esterhuizen down were backs, Vunivalu is now isolated completely out wide thanks to Parecki not shifting far away enough from the ruck. Only Tom Wright is outside him. Vunivalu ends up totally unprepared for du Toit's carry, and after being sucked in, he leaves the wing unprotected with an overlap to Arendse while Wright tackles arm. Koroi Beshi and Vunivalu try to fill the space, but they fail to do so before Arendse gets his hat-trick. While the floodgates I mentioned before were references to the scoreline, it was also in reference to Australia's bad discipline. Arendse's hat-trick is followed up by Parecki being yellow-carded for illegally taking down the maul, which resulted in a penalty try. A second penalty try is awarded later on, with Vunivalu directly knocking down a pass from Grant Williams deliberately. He was of course yellow carded as well, and both of those yellow cards were the correct call from the referee. South Africa's final try of the game was a classic example of them doing what they do best. As we can see, they toil away at the try line for ages before their man advantage works in their favour. Wright has a man on the outside to mark, allowing du Toit to touch down by entering this gap between Wright and the ruck, which wouldn't have been there had Australia not had that yellow card to Vunivalu. The Wallabies did get a last minute consolation try to Carter Gordon, but I don't think that would have saved their sorrows because Eddie Jones is going to have plenty to change for the team. As we can see with the full-time stats, South Africa finished off with 63% possession, but the territory increase was huge compared to the first half. It had gone up to 60%. As they did in the first half, they also finished the entire game with more meters, defenders beaten, clean breaks, carries, passes and offloads in the Wallabies, and that is not very normal from the Springboks. I'm really pleased to see that they've been playing an expansive game and that they have indeed evolved. Jacques Nienaber, after their Rugby Championship was cost by their points differential last year, he has clearly watched the Six Nations to watch the Irish and the French to see their expansive rugby, and Jacques Nienaber clearly understands the mandate that South Africa will need a decent points differential to make it to the knockout stages of the World Cup, and so they are running the ball as best they can right now because that points differential is what's going to get them through to the playoffs of the World Cup. Anyway, tackle stats, like I said, I won't commentate on South Africa's, but Australia's tackle percentage definitely did go down a little bit in that second half. The goal kick success, not very good either, whereas the ruck success also went down a little bit. The scrum as well, they evened up a little bit more, those scrums. The scrum was far better from South Africa in the second half, and as I said, there was the risk of, well, they made just pieces of biltong out of the Australian rookie props. The discipline, though, like I was saying, just terrible in the second half. After that hat-trick to Arendse, the Wallabies just started conceding so many penalties and they ended the game with 15 total penalties, including the 2 yellow cards, while the Springboks had amazing discipline in the second half, being penalised just once. The big talking points: I worry that Eddie Jones is going to have a harder time fixing the Wallabies than improving Japan because, when businesses mismanage themselves for so long, it's very difficult. It's a lot harder to repair broken adults than it is to grow strong children, as a lot of people have said to me in the past. The Springboks, on the other hand, I've talked about them all video long. I think they're tracking pretty well and they're going to win the Rugby Championship. The Wallabies, though, Eddie Jones is very easily going to be swinging the axe. Tom Hooper, Dave Parecki, Suliasi Vunivalu, probably the main culprits. They're really going to need Bell and Taniela Tupou back from injury as well, because those two were severely missed for that second half. And wow, the Springboks to get that done against the fresh Australian locks. This game would have been far worse if Dave Rennie was the head coach. The Springboks, though, for all their goods, they weren't perfect. Considering their possession rate, they definitely could have scored probably another 30 points or so, and without those penalty tries, they still would only put 29 points on the board, as they weren't as active in that second half. And so my biggest question for the Springboks at the end of this video, now that I've discussed the negatives that Australia did, is can they go up a gear? I would like to see that happen very much. The Wallabies, on the other hand, it's going to take time for them to get better. A lot of people are trying to say Eddie Jones bad, blah, 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 but you know what? At least Jones isn't scared to make those risky decisions. And man, it's going to be very tough for the Wallabies. I do think they did really well with discipline in the first half. They really challenged that scrum in the first half. But man, they still need to adjust to test rugby after all that time in Super Rugby. And so I'm going to end the video over here, guys. A big thank you to my patrons at the end of this video over here. You guys are awesome. I also have a Threads account and an Instagram account that you can support. And man, wow, what a game that was. Make sure to subscribe to me, like this video, and comment your thoughts on this video now that we're at the end of it. I'm going to see you guys later. I'm going to go off and edit this thing. Cheers for watching from Max.